Today we did a video about what college football looked like 10 years ago as we went back to week 1 and talked about the top games, players, and storylines. I figured we'd do something similar again for tonight's video and go back in time and take a look at the SEC back in 2014. More specifically, who are the starting quarterbacks, how did they do, and where are they now? I've done a lot of videos like this in the channel's history, so I hope you guys enjoy it as we're going to go through each and every starting quarterback from the 2014 SEC season, talk about the numbers they put up, who they were, and ultimately where they are a decade later. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and take a look back at the SEC quarterbacks from 2014. So like always, Vanderbilt came in at number 14, and they actually had two starting quarterbacks that year. The first one was Patton Robinette. He was a guy who had been in the program for a couple of years and ended up going to Maryville High School and was actually the number 10 dual threat quarterback in the class of 2012. Robinette would end up having a decent season in 2014 as he threw for 1,096 yards with 7 touchdowns and 8 picks. I take that back, it wasn't decent at all. He was decent the year before though. Patton Robinette ended up getting benched and apparently went to medical school where he is doing that now. The other guy who took over was Johnny McCrary. I don't know if you guys remember him, but he was the son of a former NFL player and at one point was a 4-star recruit coming out of Cedar Grove High School. McCrary would end up doing decent in 2014. McCrary ended up throwing for 985 yards with 9 touchdowns and 8 picks, and then would spend one more year with Vanderbilt before he would transfer over to Mercer, and now is a coach with Ohio Wesleyan. Vanderbilt didn't really have much going at the QB position, but that is what happened to them. Okay, so at number 13, we have the Florida Gators. They also had two different quarterbacks, and the first one was Jeff Driscoll. At one point, he was the number 1 quarterback in high school, and he was a 5-star recruit and seen as the next big thing. Driscoll would end up having a weird 2014 season in which he threw for 1,100 yards with 9 touchdowns and 10 picks. He decided to transfer to Louisiana Tech for the following season, where he threw for 4,000 yards and 27 touchdowns. He'd eventually get taken in the 6th round with the 207th overall pick by the 49ers, and ever since then, Driscoll has bounced around. He's on the Bengals, the Lions, the Broncos, the Texans, the Browns, and now he's with the Commanders. Despite being somewhat of a bust in college, Driscoll actually made it to the NFL and has been really successful holding the clipboard. The other guy was Treyon Harris. Treyon Harris was a 3-year starter at the famous Booker T. Washington High School in Florida and led his team to state championships back-to-back years. He was a 4-star recruit, and in 2014, Harris would throw for 1,100 yards with 9 touchdowns and 4 interceptions, and he was also more of a threat on the ground. Harris would then play one more year in 2015 with the Gators before he would transfer across the country, eventually becoming a wide receiver for Tennessee State. I'm honestly not sure what he is up to nowadays. It is that time of the year as winning season is back, football is back, and MyBookie is here to make sure you are ready to cash in on all the action. This season, MyBookie is pulling out all the stops with incredible promotions like a weekly risk-free boost on Thursdays where you can bet without a sweat. If your bet hits, you win big. If it doesn't, forget it. MyBookie will refund your wager. But that's just the beginning. MyBookie is giving away hundreds of thousands in prizes with their Super, Survivor, and Square contests. Get your entries now in for your shot at huge cash rewards. When you're ready to get started, be sure to use my promo code FISHER50 and make sure to get some extra cash on top of your first deposit. Okay, but what do you get when you use my promo code? Well, if you type in FISHER50, you'll get up to $1,000 in a welcome bonus bet plus a $10 casino chip. MyBookie's tiered bonuses make it easy to deposit with crypto or with credit, and the bigger your deposit, the bigger your bonus. The bonus would be 100% match up to $1,000 plus a $10 casino chip. With MyBookie, you can bet on anything, anywhere, at any time, and make your season a winning season. Be sure to check out my link down below and use my promo code FISHER50. That is FISHER50. Our last team that had split quarterback duties was the Tennessee Volunteers. The first guy they had play was Justin Worley. He was a decently highly recruited player coming out of high school. Worley got his first start in 2013, and in 2014 he threw for 1,600 yards with 12 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. Worley would eventually end up losing out to Josh Dobbs, who was the 4-star recruit coming out of high school, and he ended up throwing for 1,200 yards and 9 scores. Over the next 2 years, Dobbs would lead them to very successful seasons, including some super memorable moments, and he'd eventually get drafted in the 4th round with the 135th overall pick by the Pittsburgh Steelers. Dobbs is a lot like Jeff Driscoll, as he has gone from team to team, going from the Steelers to the Titans, the Cardinals, then to the Minnesota Vikings. He's a journeyman player, and neither of those guys were really that great in 2014. The next team that had 2 quarterbacks was Texas A&M, and the first guy who started was Kenny Hill. Wow, that is definitely a flashback in time, as Kenny Hill ended up becoming a big-time recruit coming out of high school and was the backup to Johnny Manziel in 2013. In 2014, he'd set the world on fire in Week 1 as he'd break the school record for passing yards in a game set by Johnny Manziel in a win over a top 10 South Carolina team. Ultimately, Hill would throw for 2,649 yards with 23 touchdowns, but he would end up flaming out. Kyle Allen then got an opportunity to come in as he was a huge 5-star, and Allen ended up throwing for 1,300 yards. He was the starter for part of the time in 2015 and then eventually transferred to Houston. He ended up going undrafted in the NFL, but has gotten a couple of opportunities as he played with the Panthers, the Commanders, the Texans, and the Bills. Kenny Hill, on the other hand, ended up transferring to TCU after that season, where he led them to a hot start in 2017, but ultimately would flame out and did not make the NFL. Up next, we get to go over to LSU and talk about Anthony Jennings. He ended up finishing 11th in the SEC in passing as he threw for 1,600 yards with 11 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. But before that, he was a 4-star recruit and a top 15 quarterback coming out of Marietta, Georgia. Anthony Jennings would do decent in 2014, but would not really play again until 2016. At that point, he had transferred to Louisiana Lafayette, where he threw for 2,100 yards with 11 touchdowns and 13 picks. Jennings ended up being underwhelming. Obviously, that's not a great stat line, and ultimately Jennings was somewhat of a bust. He had his one moment in 2014 with LSU, but it went pretty quickly. College football is so different now than it was then. Hudson Mason ended up going to Lasseter High School in Marietta, Georgia, and as a senior threw for nearly 4,500 yards and 54 touchdowns. He became the Gatorade Football Player of the Year, a 4-star recruit, and in total had nearly 8,300 yards and 85 touchdowns. He would arrive as a true freshman at Georgia in 2010 and would end up backing up Aaron Murray for literally his entire career pretty much. Eventually, Hudson Mason would get his opportunity to start in 2014, as he would then throw for 2,168 yards, 21 touchdowns, and only 4 interceptions. Mason ended up having a really good year for the Dogs and waited his turn, and then from there he would sign an undrafted free agent deal with the Redskins, would play a little bit for the Saskatchewan Roughriders, and then also played in the Spring League in 2017. After that, he retired from football and did some color commentary for ESPN, started doing his own radio show, also was one of 5 hosts on The Locker Room, worked for The Federalist, and also won the long drive competition at a golf classic. He's kind of one of those guys who did everything and is a little bit of a legend in the Georgia sports world. Coming in at number 9 on the SEC passing list was Brandon Allen. Everyone pretty much knows him, but going back in time, he ended up going to Fayetteville High School in Arkansas, and as a senior threw for 3,400 yards. He also had 38 touchdowns and was ranked as a top 10 quarterback recruit in his class. He ended up coming in 2011 and was the backup to Tyler Wilson, and then in 2013 he would finally take over as the starter and would become the next big thing for Brett Bielema. He ended up throwing for 2,285 yards with 20 touchdowns and only 5 interceptions. Brandon Allen had a really decent year, and in 2014, he improved to 2,200 yards and 20 touchdowns. In 2014, he would end up throwing for 2,285 yards with 20 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. And then in 2015, he'd have an even bigger year, throwing for 3,500 yards and 30 touchdowns. Eventually, he was taken in the 6th round with the 201st overall pick by the Jacksonville Jaguars and ended up playing a little bit in the league. He ended up spending time with the Jags, the Rams, the Broncos, the Bengals, and now he is with the San Francisco 49ers. In total, he has started 9 games with a 2-7 record and has thrown for 1,600 yards and 10 touchdowns. He's also the brother of Austin Allen, who ended up playing quarterback for the Razorbacks as well, and his dad was the director of high school and NFL relations for the Arkansas Razorbacks. Up next, we get to talk about a really fun name in Nick Marshall. Coming out of Pineview, Georgia, he was a 3-sport athlete. He played basketball, football, and track, and ended up throwing for 3,000 yards and 32 touchdowns. He ended up deciding to play corner for the University of Georgia, and eventually he was dismissed for breaking team rules. He transferred to Garden City Community College and ended up being a good starting quarterback there, and then in 2013, he took back over for Gus Malzahn and ended up leading them to one of the most crazy seasons in school history. Whether it was the Georgia Tip Pass, the crazy victory over Bama in the Iron Bowl, or their victory over Mizzou in the SEC Championship game, Nick Marshall had some great moments, but ultimately fell short. In 2014, Marshall would end up passing for 2,532 yards with 20 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. Marshall was also dynamic on the ground as he ran for 798 yards and 11 more touchdowns. While he wouldn't end up getting drafted, he did get an opportunity to play in the NFL as he played 13 games at Jacksonville in 2015 and then 5 games with the New York Jets in 2016. From there, he went over to the Canadian Football League and has sort of just kind of fallen off the face of the earth. Coming in at number 7 on the SEC passing list was Matty Mock. Oh boy, is this a fun one. He ended up becoming one of the best quarterbacks in high school football history, as he was the son of Mike Mock and went to Kenton High School. His older brother ended up being a really big deal as well, as he ended up going to Cincinnati, but Mock holds multiple national high school football records. He holds the record for completions with 1,353, for passing attempts, for passing yards, and total yards. He also held the passing records, but then was eventually beat out by Jake Browning. As I said, his brother Ben Mock went to Cincinnati, but eventually Matty would end up becoming a 4-star recruit and would decide to sign with Gary Pinkel and Mizzou. He redshirted in 2012 and then was thrusted into the mix in 2013 after James Franklin got hurt in that Georgia game. Mock would play in a couple of games, but then would eventually take over in 2014. Mock would pass for 2,648 yards with 25 touchdowns and 13 interceptions. He led Mizzou to the SEC championship, but from there things would get very interesting for Mock. He was suspended for violation of team rules, and eventually that was due to a failed drug test. Mizzou had a terrible season, Gary Pinkel would retire after it was all over, and Drew Lock became the starter. Matty Mock was completely forgotten about and would eventually transfer over to Eastern Kentucky, where he ended up throwing for 300 yards with 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions. He ended up playing in the CFL in 2017 and then ended up becoming a high school football coach. What's really funny is this video is actually what made me blow up on YouTube, and if you haven't checked that out from 4 years ago, be sure to check it out. And I think it has like 800 something thousand views. Up next, we have another really interesting name, and it's a guy that I'm actually personally friends with. Patrick Towles was a huge recruit coming out of Highlands High School in Kentucky and was actually ranked as the number 10 pro-style quarterback in his class. He ended up joining Mark Stoops in Kentucky in 2012, and Towles would end up passing for 2,718 yards with 14 touchdowns and 9 picks. In 2015, things would fall apart, as while he did throw for 2,000 yards, he this time had 9 touchdowns and 14 interceptions. In 2016, he would transfer over to Boston College, where he would throw for 1,730 yards with 12 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. What's really interesting is after that, he decided to become a Focus missionary. Focus stands for Fellowship of Catholic University Students, and that is how I actually got to know Patrick. I actually did a little bit of work with Focus as well, and Patrick and I got connected, and I believe he is still doing that to this day. Very small world, and he's a really great dude. Up next, we have to talk about Bo Wallace. Bo Wallace would finish at number 4 in the SEC, throwing for 3,194 yards with 22 touchdowns and 14 picks. Bo would end up starting his career in 2010 at Arkansas State before he would eventually transfer to East Mississippi Community College. He ended up setting JUCO records for passing touchdowns and total offense, and because of that would transfer to play for Hugh Freeze at Ole Miss. In 2012, he ended up passing for nearly 3,000 yards and 22 touchdowns, but he really struggled with turnovers these next 2 years. In 2013, he threw for 3,300 yards and 18 touchdowns, and then in 2014, he obviously had 3,194 yards and 24 scores. Bo Wallace famously led Ole Miss to a great season in 2014 and that historic upset against Alabama. After that, he ended up becoming the quarterback's coach at Marshall County High School in Tennessee, where his younger brother was the high school quarterback. He eventually also went back to East Mississippi Community College, and since then has been doing coaching with different schools like Pearl River Community College, Holmes Community College, and the University School of Jackson. In 2014, we saw one of the best stories in college football in Mississippi State. Under head coach Dan Mullen, the Bulldogs finally found some SEC prominence and were at one point ranked number 1 in the country. Still though, Dak Prescott, the quarterback, was never really supposed to be here. While he did put up big numbers, throwing for 2,800 yards and 39 touchdowns as a senior, people didn't really believe in him as a quarterback. Ultimately, he would go to Mississippi State and then would end up being the backup to Tyler Russell, and then in 2013 he passed for 1,900 yards with 10 touchdowns and also ran for nearly 1,000 more on the ground. Prescott ended up going crazy in 2014, throwing for 3,449 yards and 27 touchdowns, and also rushing for 986 yards and 14 touchdowns. As I said, at one point Mississippi State was ranked number 1 in the country. He was a legitimate Heisman contender, and then he put up big numbers once again in 2015, combining for over 4,000 yards and 40 touchdowns. Prescott would eventually get taken in the 4th round with the 135th overall pick by the Cowboys, and we all know how that's gone. He's put up big numbers and hasn't really won anything big, but Prescott signed a huge contract and ended up being very successful after his time at Mississippi State. At number 2 on the passing list, we have Blake Sims. He is a guy who I give a lot of props to, as he, just like Hudson Mason, sat on the bench for quite some time. He He ended up going to Gainesville High School in Georgia, where he was a star on all sides of the football. He put up huge numbers and eventually became a 4-star recruit. He was considered an athlete and eventually decided to sign with Alabama. From 2010 to 2013, he'd play running back and backup quarterback for the Crimson Tide and would finally make his first career start in 2014 after he beat out Jake Coker for the starting position. Sims would throw for 3,487 yards with 28 touchdowns and 10 interceptions, and honestly, this was the first time where we saw Alabama have more of a passing offense. I believe he broke the school record for single-season passing yards in that moment, and Sims would end up finishing his career strong. He ended up also running for 350 yards and 7 touchdowns, and while Sims did not get drafted, he did get an opportunity to try out with both the Packers and the Redskins. He ultimately was not signed and then went over to the CFL for a couple of years before he eventually actually signed with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 2016. After that, he went to the Arena League, and as of March of 2023, he was the OC and QB's coach for Mount Bethel Christian Academy. Looks like he's going into coaching, and Blake Sims had a very successful college career. Okay, so at number 1, we actually had Dylan Thompson. I don't know if you guys really remember him. I definitely remember him, but he's definitely not a huge name by any means. Dylan Thompson went to Boiling Springs High School in South Carolina and would eventually become part of their 2010 class. Thompson would end up being a backup for his first 4 years on campus before taking over as the starter for Connor Shaw in 2014. In his 1 year, Thompson went crazy. He threw for 3,564 yards with 26 touchdowns and 11 interceptions. He also ran for 4 more on the ground, and as I said, he led the SEC in passing yards and would end up finishing 3rd in touchdown passes. Dylan Thompson had a great season for South Carolina, and after it was over, he would go undrafted in the 2015 NFL Draft, but would sign with the San Francisco 49ers and was eventually on their practice squad. While he would get released, he'd get another opportunity with the Los Angeles Rams, and then that would fall apart. From there, he decided to give up on playing professionally and would go into coaching. What's interesting is he was actually hired as a director of player development for Charleston Southern's basketball team. Then after that, he went to the NFL and became a character coach, did team development for the Houston Texans, and as of now, he is the director of team support for the Washington Commanders. It seems like he has gone into a PR coaching type role in the NFL, and after a successful 1 season in the SEC, Thompson ended up being very successful. So looking back, this year was quite interesting. You had a couple of first-year starting quarterbacks like Dylan Thompson, Blake Sims, and Hudson Mason finally do really well. You saw some upperclassmen like Nick Marshall, Brandon Allen, Bo Wallace, and Dak Prescott break out. Then you had a weird season from Matty Mock. You saw a glimpse of the future with Kyle Allen. Patrick Tolles was and then you also saw some underwhelming players like Anthony Jennings, Jeff Driscoll, Johnny McCrary, and Justin Worley. The SEC was a lot different in 2014 than it is in 2024, and I hope you guys enjoyed today's breakdown. If you did, be sure to let me know down below. Leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.